This morning, as Sarah said, we're starting a new series in the book of 1 John, which is often called a letter, but it's not a letter. It is more of a poetic sermon. And John is writing this sermon, most scholars believe, to the church in Ephesus, that this community has been going through struggles, and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John are this treatise that he is writing a sermon to them, offering them some advice. And in this series of 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, he is using the text of Jesus from the book of John, chapters 13 through 17. So if you're wondering where the depth of content that John is sharing, kind of the theological underpinning of what John is sharing, it's coming out of the Gospel of John, chapters 13 through 17. Now, this sermon that John is writing is not linear, right? We get the book and it has chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And we think that you're reading them and they're just going to follow right along, and that's how this plays. But that was not the type of sermon that John's writing, and he was choosing a little bit of a different approach, which scholars call the amplification approach. So imagine, if you will, kind of core themes being laid out, and then John just keeps hitting them over and over and over again. And it's going to feel like, as you're reading this book, that he's just saying the same thing over and over and over again. And it's because he is. Because he knows what I know, that if I say something once, it goes out your ears and into nothingness like it does mine. But if we say the same thing generation after generation after generation over and over again, that sooner or later it becomes who we are. And there are three kind of core things that John is going to hit on over and over and over again: life, love, and light. And that these three things, John will say, lead us to understanding what is true. So light, love, light, and truth. And he's going to do this cyclical repetition with lots of hyperbole and very stark moments of contrast. So he's going to contrast life and death, light and darkness, love and hate. And he's going to show us these distinctions and how they play in our existence as we head into this set of sermons. So we're going to do a sermon on every chapter of this book. So my challenge to you is that for the next week, just read 1 John 1 over and over and over again. And that might sound like a lot, but it's only 10 verses. So it's not hard. I heard the groan whenever she said, I'm reading the whole first book, and then it was done before you even knew it was done. So again, I challenge you into that. So there is something about light that changes everything. Think about the last time the power went out at your house. One moment, everything is illuminated, there's soft glow of lamps, the gentle hum of your refrigerator, the flicker of the television, and then suddenly, darkness and quiet. I don't know about you, but your hand either instinctively reaches for a light switch, or if you're like me, you pull out your phone and you get as quickly as you can to your flashlight app. And if it's in the middle of the night and you can't find your phone, you're kind of just groping hesitantly for a flashlight, a candle, anything to push back the darkness. Then when we find it, a single light, whether it's a flickering flame, a beam from our iPhone, or any other light source, the room suddenly feels different. The light changes our perspective. We can see the things that were hidden. You can move with confidence that you're not going to step on your kids' Legos. And this is what John's talking about in the opening to his letter. This is the message that we have heard from him and declared to you, John says. God is light. In him there is no darkness at all. Light for John is not simply a metaphor. It's a revelation. It's a reality. And for John, it is a force that changes everything. Now, John begins this letter not with a deep theological treatise or concept, but simply with personal testimony. He says, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our own eyes, which we have looked at and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of life. You can hear the urgency in his voice, the weight of those words. This isn't an abstract idea for the community of John. This is real, it's tangible, it's touchable. John is saying, I was there. I heard his voice. I saw the way that Jesus loved people. I watched him turn loaves and fish into a feast. I stood at the foot of the cross when the sky turned black. I was in the room when Jesus, risen, appeared, showing us his scars and inviting us to touch them. But let's be honest. Testimonies like this can be hard to trust. I wasn't there. We weren't there. We didn't hear the voice or see the miracles or touch the scars. And lest we think we're the first in this experience, the same thing. This is why I love Thomas, right? Thomas walks in and says, I wasn't there. I got to touch to believe. And then when Jesus appears to him, he says, okay, here you go. And doubt, as Mike taught us last week, doubt is not the enemy of faith. Doubt is the companion on the road towards faith. If you've ever wrestled with questions like, did Jesus really exist? Is all this real, or is it just a story that people tell to find meaning? Then you're in good company. Because faith that has never asked questions at all isn't faith, it's certainty. And John knows that believing in something unseen isn't very easy. And that's why he's writing this letter to the church in Ephesus, is he's saying, I get that you may not have seen the things that I saw. So let me help. That's why he begins with what he knows. Not to shut down doubt, but to offer a starting point. If you need a place to begin, you trust me, so let me tell you about what I understand. And he's not making an abstract claim. He's saying, I was there. I don't expect you to believe blindly, but I do want you to hear my story. And maybe that's where faith begins. Not with certainty, but with an openness to the possibility that the story might be true. That love really did take on flesh. That God really did step into the mess of our human existence. That light really does destroy darkness. And John isn't asking us to abandon our question. He's inviting us to listen, to lean in, and to wonder, what if it's true? But John doesn't stop there with his testimony. He moves toward transformation. He says, if we claim to have fellowship with him and yet walk in darkness, we lie and we do not live out the truth. This is where John gets real, and the community of Ephesus that he's sharing this sermon with start squirming in their pew chairs. John isn't interested in theoretical faith. He wants to know, are we walking in the light of the way of Jesus? It's easy to say we believe in God, right? It's easy to say that we love Jesus. But John pushes us deeper. He says, if you believe in this Jesus, does your life reflect it? Are you walking in a way that is like the way of Jesus? And this is where he calls us to a point of honesty. We all at some point have been in darkness. You know, the kind of darkness that creeps into our hearts, where we begin to live discentered from God's love. That little closet where we start to hold grudges, where we refuse to forgive, where we say, oh, it's not gossip. I'm just sharing some stories. Where we manipulate, where we twist the truth in order to serve ourselves. And here's the thing about darkness. We get used to it. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night and at first you can't see a thing? And then you blink your eyes a few times and all of a sudden things that you couldn't once see now become more clear because our eyes adjust. And what once felt overwhelming, this complete lack of sight, starts to feel normal. See, darkness doesn't just happen to individuals. Sometimes these breaches in love can happen communally. And this is who John is writing to, right? He's not writing to the one jerk in the church in Ephesus telling him to get his life together, right? He might have wanted to, but he didn't. Instead, he's writing to this entire community. And he's reminding us that what starts as a small compromise, a whispered justification, then little by little, our community and our beings adjust to it. And we convince ourselves that it's not a big deal. And then sooner or later, the darkness becomes our norm. But John isn't saying, don't adjust into the dark. He's saying, make the active movement to step into the light. That God is the light. Move toward the light. Because something happens when we bring our lives and our communities into the light of God's presence. He confesses and continues and says, if we confess our sins, God is faithful and just and will forgive our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness. Confession isn't just about shame, it's about connection. I remember growing up a good Southern Baptist boy that when I heard confession, I just thought Catholic, right? This is what confession means, just that's what Catholics do. And then I became a young adult and had a spiritual experience of being with friends who began to share what they were struggling with each other. And in that space of that sharing, my life became richer and those relationships became deeper and my connection to God felt more rooted because I had brought what was dark into the light. Confession isn't about shame. It's not about groveling before God. It's about stepping into the light and making relationships right. Because as I'll say all through Lent, I'm projecting for you, sin is merely the failure to bother to love. And anytime we fail to love, there's a breach in relationship. Confession is about saying, this is where I messed up. And this is where I'm moving toward the light. And the beauty of confession, John tells us, is that God will always meet us with mercy. See, so often I think we think about confession and we are turned off by the idea of it because the image that we have for God in our heads, or that we were handed of God in our heads, is this idea that God is vengeful, that he is full of wrath. And we think that anytime we talk to God and we open up this light of our life into our dark spaces, that we're going to be met with condemnation. But John tells us the opposite is true. The moment that we step into the light, we are not met with rejection, but instead with forgiveness. But confession is more than simply admitting our mistakes. It's about embracing the kind of vulnerability that leads to real connection. As researcher and author Brené Brown puts it, vulnerability is the birthplace for innovation, creativity, change, and freedom. When we confess, we speak our truth about where we have broken relationships with God and with each other and with ourselves and with the creation. We are not weakening ourselves. We're allowing ourselves to step into light. And when we allow ourselves to be seen, we create space for transformation. Brown reminds us that staying vulnerable is a risk that we have to take if we want to experience connection. And this is exactly what John is saying. If we walk in the light, we will have fellowship with one another, he says. I don't know about you, but the word vulnerability makes me nauseous. It's not something that I frequently want to do or talk about. Heck, confession makes me nauseous. And yet, this is the hard part about walking in the light. This is what we're called to in this way of Jesus. Our connection to God is tied to our connection with each other. And when we hide in darkness, relationships suffer. But when we step into the light, we find the community that our heart was built for and that we've been longing for since the very beginning of time. Vulnerability is scary. But it is also the only way to be fully known and fully loved. You will not experience full knowing and full loving until we choose to be vulnerable. So maybe confession isn't about guilt at all. Maybe it's actually an invitation, a way to step into freedom, a way to say, this is who I am, good and bad, and I trust that I can still be loved in the midst of it. And God's answer to that vulnerability, every single time, is grace. John's message is simple, but it is not easy. He says, if we claim to have fellowship with him and yet walk in the darkness, we lie and we don't live out the truth. We hear walking in light and we think about morality, but I want us to think about something else other than simply doing what is right. I want us to understand that walking in the light is something deeper. It's about walking in relationship with the one who's loved us from the very beginning. What if walking in the light means refusing to let darkness become normal? Think of Germany in the 1930s. A nation does not wake up one morning and suddenly to decide to embrace the horrors of Nazi ideology. It happens gradually. First, a narrative is created. Certain people are a problem. Then policies are enacted, and those people lost rights. The neighborhoods looked away as Jewish businesses were vandalized and as people were arrested for nothing more than their heritage. Then the darkness grew. And then it seeped into their workplaces, and the darkness grew. And it seeped into the schools, and the darkness grew. And into the pulpits, and the darkness grew. And it became like the darkness was normal. Now, there were people who resisted, of course. There were lights in the midst of the darkness. They were called the Confessing Church Movement. Pastors like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, ordinary families who hid their Jewish neighbors in attics. But for many, fear and indifference kept them in their own shadows. And it's easy to say, well, I would have done the right thing. But history tells us that darkness doesn't ask for permission before it moves in. It inches forward little by little until we stop noticing it. So much so that our Lutheran churches of heritage ushered in the darkness. And it doesn't just happen on a grand scale. It happens in our families and in our churches and in our hearts. And that's what John is warning us about. Sin is not just personal, but it's communal. The easier I live my darkness in you, around you, the easier it is for you to live your darkness around me. Sin is the kind that we accept because it's easier than fighting it. So we adjust to it because it feels safer than stepping into the light. But here's the good news. Light always pushes back darkness. Every time someone tells the truth in a culture built on lies, light breaks in. Every time someone refuses to dehumanize their enemy, light breaks in. Every time someone speaks out for justice, even when it costs them, light breaks in. And to walk in the light is to refuse to allow darkness to have the final word. So here's the question. Where are we walking in darkness today? Not just in our personal habits, but in the way we participate in systems that hurt people. In the ways that we ignore suffering because it's easier than facing it. The civil rights movement offers a profound example of what it means to step into the light. In the 1950s and 60s, Black Americans were told to wait. They were told that segregation and discrimination weren't that bad. That change would come eventually. Just hold on, wait. But leaders like MLK refused to accept that. In his letter to the Birmingham jail, he wrote to white pastors who criticized him for not being patient enough. And they told him to just trust the system. Things would unfold naturally, to stop stirring up trouble. His response? We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. Darkness grows when good people stay silent. Walking in the light is not passive. It is not just about confessing a personal sin. Yes, that is very important, but it's also choosing to see and act in a way that lets the light enter. Refusing to look away, but shining your flashlights, pulling out your iPhones and shining light into the dark spaces. Because light doesn't just expose. Light heals. It transforms. So what if we stopped hiding? What if we believed that the places that we are most afraid to expose, our prejudice, our failures, our complicity, are the very places that God is waiting to meet us? Stepping into the light isn't about having all the answers. It's about trust. It's about saying, here I am. All my flaws, all my mess, all my blind spots, all of the broken pieces that were handed to me and formed in me as I was a child, all of these things, here I am, and believing that God's answer will be, I see you, I love you, let's walk forward together. The invitation is simple. Step into the light. Because God is light, and in him there is no darkness. Please pray with me. God, we all come with our stuff. The rough edges, the broken spots, the places of our childhood that seem to haunt us, that we can't move away from, that we act in ways, as Paul says, I do the things I don't want to do, and the things I want to do, I can't do. So we come into this space acknowledging that we come both as fully saint and fully sinner, fully beautiful, fully broken. And we offer ourselves to you in as much light as we can possibly bear. Give us courage. Courage to open the dark closets of our being before you. Courage to open the dark closets of our being to those that we trust around us. And help us to walk into your light.